The jungle fell silent on April 9, 1942. For 99 days, American and Filipino forces had held the Bataan Peninsula against impossible odds. Starving, diseased, outnumbered 5-1. They had eaten their horses, their mules, even the monkeys from the trees. Malaria claimed more men than bullets. Dysentery turned the foxholes into open graves. And now, at last, the order came to surrender. Major General Edward King stood before the Japanese commanders with trembling hands, not from fear, but from shame. He was surrendering the largest American force in history, 76,000 men, though many could barely stand. He had no authorization from General MacArthur, who had evacuated to Australia weeks earlier with his famous promise, "I shall return." King made no such promise. He knew what was coming. The Japanese called it a march. The prisoners would call it something else entirely. 65 miles, from Marveles on the southern tip of Bataan to San Fernando, then by rail to Camp O'Donnell. Under normal circumstances, perhaps a 3-day journey. But these were not normal circumstances. These were not normal men. And this would not be a normal march. Private Leon Beck from Kentucky would later remember the moment it began. They lined us up in columns of 4, hundreds of us, thousands. We stretched back into the jungle as far as you could see. Some men could barely walk. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi. We were walking skeletons in torn uniforms, and the guards, they were smiling. The first men to die did so within the first mile. An American colonel, too weak to continue, sat down beside the road. A Japanese guard approached with his rifle. No warning, no hesitation. The bayonet went through the colonel's throat. The body was left where it fell, a message to the others: keep moving or join him. The rules were simple. There were no rules. If you stopped, you died. If you fell, you died. If you asked for water, you might die. If you helped another man, you both might die. The guards moved up and down the column with systematic cruelty, selecting victims with the randomness of a lottery and the certainty of execution. Sergeant Alf Larson from Minnesota watched a Japanese soldier pull a young Filipino private from the line. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. The guard ordered him to dig a hole. The boy dug, his hands shaking. When the hole was deep enough, the guard shot him in the back of the head. The body fell forward into its own grave. We had to keep marching, Larson would later testify. We walked past him. We walked past all of them. What else could we do? The sun rose higher. The temperature climbed above 100 degrees. The men had been on quarter rations for months, some subsisting on 800 calories a day, less than half what a human body needs to survive. Now they marched under the Philippine sun without food, without water, without rest. The Japanese had not planned for this many prisoners. Their own supply lines were stretched thin, and perhaps more critically, they had not expected surrender. In the Japanese military code, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. A soldier who surrendered was less than human, unworthy of mercy or dignity. The prisoners were about to learn what that meant. Artesian wells dotted the roadside, precious sources of water in the tropical heat. The prisoners could see them, could smell the water, could hear it trickling. The guards would not let them drink. Instead, they watched as men collapsed from dehydration within feet of salvation. Some prisoners broke ranks in desperation, crawling toward the wells. They were shot before they reached the water. Lieutenant William Dyess, who would later escape and bring news of the march to the world, witnessed a scene that would haunt him forever. A group of Filipino soldiers, delirious with thirst, rushed a well. The guards opened fire. Bodies fell into the water. The well ran red, and still men tried to drink from it. I saw a Filipino soldier cupping his hands into the bloody water, drinking it, because even blood-tainted water was better than dying of thirst.
The column moved north, through sugarcane fields and rice paddies, through villages where Filipino civilians watched in horror, sometimes trying to throw food or water to the prisoners. The guards beat them back. Anyone who helped the prisoners was beaten. Some were shot. The Filipinos learned to watch in silence, their grief hidden behind carefully neutral faces. But not always. In the town of Lubao, a Filipino woman ran from her house with a bucket of water and a ladle. She began giving water to the prisoners as they passed. A guard struck her with his rifle butt. She fell, but rose again, still holding the bucket. The guard raised his rifle to shoot her. An officer intervened, shouting orders. The woman was dragged away, beaten unconscious. The water spilled into the dirt. The prisoners marched on. Corporal Lester Tenney from Chicago developed a survival strategy. Become invisible. Walk in the middle of the column, never at the edges where guards prowled. Keep your eyes down. Show no weakness, no emotion, no humanity. Become a ghost. The ones who cried were killed, Tenney remembered. The ones who complained were killed. The ones who showed fear were killed. So I stopped being human. I stopped feeling anything. I just put one foot in front of the other. At night, they were herded into barbed wire enclosures, packed so tightly that men could not lie down. They slept, standing up, leaning against each other like a forest of dead trees. The guards patrolled the perimeter with bayonets, stabbing anyone who pressed against the wire. In the morning, they counted the bodies. Dysentery, malaria, exhaustion, murder. The dead were left behind. The living marched on. The sun treatment was reserved for those who angered the guards. Prisoners would be forced to sit in the open sun for hours, without water, without shade, without movement. Their skin blistered, their brains cooked. Men went mad, screaming at visions only they could see. When they finally died, the guards would laugh and select new victims. Private Blair Robinette from Texas tried to help a friend who had collapsed. A guard saw him. Robinette was pulled from the line and beaten with a bamboo pole until he could no longer stand. Then he was bayoneted in the stomach and thrown into a ditch. He survived by playing dead, lying among corpses for hours until the column passed. Filipino guerrillas found him 2 days later. He was one of the lucky ones. The march revealed something about human nature that few wanted to acknowledge. How quickly civilization disappears, how thin the veneer of humanity really is. Some men became heroes, sharing their last drops of water, carrying wounded comrades until they themselves collapsed. Others became animals, stealing food from dying men, stepping over bodies without a glance. Captain Ed Dyess watched an American soldier steal a rice ball from a Filipino private who had managed to hide it in his clothes. The American ate it while the Filipino wept. Hours later, the American was dead from dysentery. The Filipino survived the march. "I don't judge him," Dyess said later. "Starvation makes monsters of us all." On the fourth day, they reached the town of Balanga. The guards had prepared a rest area, an open field surrounded by barbed wire. 10,000 men were crammed into a space meant for hundreds. There was no water, no latrines, no shade. Men defecated where they stood,
too weak to move. The stench was overwhelming. Flies swarmed in black clouds. Disease spread like wildfire. They stayed there for 3 days. When the march resumed, 1,000 men were left behind, dead or too sick to move. The guards executed the sick where they lay. The survivors staggered north. At San Fernando, they were loaded into railroad boxcars, 115 men per car, designed for 40. The doors were sealed. The metal walls became ovens in the tropical heat. Men suffocated standing up. When the doors finally opened hours later, bodies tumbled out like cordwood. Those still alive were forced to march the final 8 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Technical Sergeant Harold Feiner from New York counted bodies as they marched. He stopped at 200. There were too many, he said. I lost count. They lined the road like mile markers all the way to the camp. Some died in ways that defied comprehension. A group of prisoners were forced to bury their own comrades in a mass grave. When the grave was full, the guards ordered half the burial detail into the pit and shot them. The other half was ordered to cover the grave, burying both the dead and the dying. Others died in ways almost merciful by comparison. Execution by beheading, quick and final. Bayoneting, brutal but fast. The lucky ones died in their sleep, slipping away from dysentery or malaria without ever waking. The unlucky ones took days. By April 24, 1942, the survivors reached Camp O'Donnell, a former Filipino military base converted into a prisoner of war camp. Of the 76,000 men who began the march, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 had died on the road. The exact number would never be known. Bodies were left unburied, burned by Filipino civilians, or simply lost to the jungle. But the march was only the beginning. Camp O'Donnell was a death camp in everything but name. No running water, no medical supplies, no food beyond a handful of rice per day. Men died at a rate of 400 per day in the first weeks, their bodies stacked like firewood outside the hospital barracks. Captain William Dyess, who would later escape and bear witness to these atrocities, wrote in his diary, "This is not war, this is murder. Systematic, deliberate, calculated murder, and the world must know." But the world didn't know, not yet. For 2 years, the story of the Bataan Death March remained hidden. The Japanese censored all news. The prisoners who survived were too weak, too scattered, too broken to tell their stories. And the United States government, fearing for the safety of the remaining prisoners, suppressed the few accounts that did emerge. It wasn't until January 1944, when Dyess and several other escapees reached Allied lines and their testimonies were finally published, that the American public learned the truth. The revelations caused outrage, demands for war crimes trials, vows of vengeance. But for the men who survived, vengeance was cold comfort. Lester Tenney would spend the rest of the war in Japanese labor camps, working as a slave in coal mines. He would watch men die by the dozens, worked to death in darkness. He survived, barely, weighing 97 pounds when American forces liberated him in August 1945. Harold Feiner contracted dysentery, malaria, and beriberi. He survived through a combination of luck, willpower, and the kindness of Filipino civilians who smuggled food into the camps at the risk of their own lives. He would spend 60 years trying to forget what he had seen. He never succeeded.
Blair Robinette, left for dead in a ditch with a bayonet wound in his stomach, was rescued by Filipino guerrillas who nursed him back to health. He would fight alongside them for the rest of the war, a ghost seeking revenge. Of the approximately 76,000 prisoners who began the march, about 54,000 reached Camp O'Donnell alive. Of those, another 20,000 would die in the camps over the following months. By war's end, only about 30,000 of the original prisoners would survive, a mortality rate of over 60%. The Japanese officers responsible would face justice, eventually. General Masaharu Homma, who commanded the forces in the Philippines, was tried for war crimes in 1946. He claimed he had no knowledge of the atrocities, that his subordinates had acted without orders. The tribunal didn't believe him. He was executed by firing squad in April 1946. But justice for the dead rings hollow. Justice doesn't bring back the men who died begging for water within sight of wells. Justice doesn't erase the memory of friends bayoneted for the crime of weakness. Justice doesn't heal the scars that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Leon Beck, who survived the march and the camps, returned to Kentucky after the war. He lived to be 94 years old. He spoke about his experiences, testified at trials, educated generations about the horrors of war. But he never stopped hearing the screams, never stopped seeing the bodies, never stopped walking that road in his nightmares. People ask me how I survived, he said in an interview decades later. I tell them I didn't. The man who survived that march died on that road. I'm just what's left. The Bataan Death March stands as one of the worst war crimes of the Second World War, a deliberate campaign of brutality that violated every convention of warfare, every standard of human decency. It was not an accident. It was not the fog of war. It was calculated cruelty, enacted by men who viewed their prisoners as less than human. But it was also a testament to resilience, to the strength of the human spirit, to the capacity of men to endure the unendurable, to survive the unsurvivable, to bear witness when bearing witness is the only weapon left. The road from Mariveles to San Fernando still exists. It's paved now, lined with markers commemorating those who died. Every April, survivors and their descendants walk portions of it, remembering. The wells still flow, the sun still burns, the jungle still stands, but the ghosts walk there too. 70,000 of them, marching forever in the heat, dying forever by the roadside, waiting forever for water that will never come. We remember them, not because remembering is easy, but because forgetting would be unforgivable. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive. The Bataan Death March stands as one of the worst war crimes of the Second World War. A deliberate campaign of brutality that violated every convention of warfare, every standard of human decency. It was not an accident. It was not the fog of war. It was calculated cruelty, enacted by men who viewed their prisoners as less than human. But it was also a testament to resilience, to the strength of the human spirit, to the capacity of men to endure the unendurable, to survive the unsurvivable, to bear witness when bearing witness is the only weapon left. The road from Maraveles to San Fernando still exists. It's paved now, lined with markers commemorating those who died. Every April, survivors and their descendants walk portions of it, remembering. The wells still flow, the sun still burns, the jungle still stands, but the ghosts walk there too. 70,000 of them, marching forever in the heat, dying forever by the roadside, waiting forever for water that will never come. We remember them not because remembering is easy, but because forgetting would be unforgivable. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive.